Guardians of their great company's spirit and protectors of its warriors' souls, they uphold tradition of their brotherhood and keep its relics safe. On the battlefield, they bellow litanies of hate and faith, fiery sermons giving grim inspiration to the warriors they accompany. Hello and welcome to this edition of Midlife Crisis. So today I thought, after spending a few weeks painting up Necron miniatures, I'd take a look at the Primeris Chaplin that came as part of the Indomitus box set, and I'm actually going to paint him up as a Spacewolves wolf priest. Taking a look over the sprue, there's some really cool detail for this model, but actually looking over the whole sprue, I think I'm going to nickname this the Sprue of Loveliness. There's some really cool looking miniatures on here, not just the Chaplin, also the Blade Guard Ancients. Without further ado, let's put on some tunes and snip some sprues. I've been a big fan of Spacewolves for a very long time. I absolutely love the lore and mythology that surrounds the Sons of Russ. So with this new Indomitus set, I thought the time was ripe for me to revisit an age-old love of Spacewolves. I've just clipped the model together so I could take a look over at how it looks, and there is an amazing amount of detail on this miniature. Overall, the actual mould looks really good. There's a few little bits that need correcting. I think what I'm going to do with this though is take it apart again. I'm going to do a sub-assembly for it, and I also want to take a look if there are any gaps as I've put the miniature together and just fill those in so I can get a really smooth finish. I'm just filling in the gaps between the joins on the miniature using Citadel's liquid green stuff, which is kind of a cross between a sort of modelling putty and a paint. I just use a stippling brush to try and push it in all the gaps, and it's actually water-based, so any runoff I just use a wet brush to move it off the miniature. And with that done, it's time to nip into the back garden to give it a good spray with the grey plastic primer. I've undercoated the miniature using a grey plastic primer, just a really cheap one from Halfords. I find that this works really well on these miniatures, and because it's actually designed as a plastic primer, it doesn't cause any melting. I started off by giving the whole miniature a really liberal coat of Abaddon Black. Although I'm painting this miniature as a wolf priest for the Spacewolves chapter, for the nod back to the Codex Astartes, as minimal as Spacewolves do nod back to the Codex Astartes, I carried on with the black armour. Next I started putting in the gold detailing using Retributor Armor. There's actually quite a lot of gold on this miniature, so this took a lot longer than I expected. I think it looks really, the finished article looks really nice, but oh my goodness, it felt like I was doing this for hours. Then moved on to use lead Belcher to paint in all the little bits of gunmetal. Also picking out the chains that were holding the various relics. With the metallics done, I then switched over to Mornfang Brown to start painting the tabard on the front of the miniature, and also the cover of the book that's tied to his back. I've left the edges of the book, the pages in black. I think I'm going to probably do some highlighting on these a bit later on. So using Wraithbone, I started painting in all the parchment that's linked to the purity seals on this model, and there is quite a lot of this parchment to be done. So there was some on his leg, there was the parchment straps across the book on his back, and there was an absolute ton on the backpack. And with all the parchment painted, I then moved on to paint all the skulls. There was skulls on the armour, skulls on the Crozius, even more skulls on the armour, on his pauldrons. In fact, I think there was more skulls than anything else on this model, and it just seemed to go on forever and ever. Just about getting to the end of the skulls, and oh, hang on his other pauldron we have another skull, and good grief, his backpack's covered in skulls as well. Oh well. Finally, with all the skulls painted in, time to paint in the wax on the purity seals. For this, I just give it a very light coat of Screamer Pink. Onto his left-hand pauldron, I gave it a coat of Averland Sunset. I find with this paint, I actually have to water it down quite a bit, so it was a case of two. In fact, I think in this, it was actually three very thin coats to get a good solid colour without any streaking or brush marks. And this is to add the distinctive pack colours for the Spacewolves. Next up, I moved on to the face. I used a watered down Rakarth Flesh to paint in all the detail, making sure that I didn't let any paint overspill over the lead Belcher for the metal mask that was covering the rest of this face that only a wolf mother could love. Finally, for the base coat, I started off by painting the feathers on the body of the eagle in the Crozius with Mornfang Brown. I wanted to try and give this a bit more of an organic look, sort of in keeping with the Space Wolf theme. So I tried my hand at a bit of wet blending and used Rhinox Hide in the centre. So so it was lighter from the edges, moving slowly towards the centre with the Rhinox Hide to try and give a more realistic feather approach. And all in all, I was pretty happy with that. So coming back to the model the next day, I started with the shading. First shade that I used was Reikland Fleshshade, and I used that to cover all the gold detailing on the armour. I thinned it down slightly with a bit of Citadel's Lahmian Medium. I find this is really good on shades and inks to allow really smooth coverage without getting sort of big dirty splodges everywhere, and it also stops it drying out too quickly. I also used the same mix of a flesh shade to do all the flesh areas on our Wolf Priest's face. I'm going to have to find a name for this guy. I think just calling him Wolf Priest. Yeah, he needs a bit of a better name than that. So, following on from the flesh shade, giving that a bit of time to dry, I then used my usual sort of Nuln Oil watered down again with the medium. In fact, I'm not even going to say watered down now every time. Just assume that I thin all these down with the Lahmian Medium. So I covered all the gunmetal parts on his belt, on the chains, on the bolter. I also gave the armour a wash with the Nuln Oil. Wasn't quite sure whether it was going to do anything, but just for consistency I thought it might be good just to give a standard coating across all metal areas, not forgetting all the areas on the power pack. I used a sepia wash, quite an old pot, but still working really well for me. I used this to give a recessed shade on all the parchment on the purity seals. And finally, the 101 skulls on the model, I used Agrax Earthshade. I actually prefer to use Agrax Earthshade on bone rather than using the Fleshshade. I think that the more sort of earthy tones, it's a nice sort of earthy weathered feel to the bones than if I was to use the Fleshshade, which has got more red in it, or the sepia colour which I used on the parchment. And finally, a quick wash of Carroburg Crimson over all the purity seals. While the washes were drying, I took the opportunity to paint the features on the base, basically the rock which the guy was standing on. I started off by just giving it a base coat of Corvus Black, just making sure that I covered all that detail, but also being really careful not to get any onto the armour. Once the Corvus Black had fully dried, I gave the rock first a dry brush of Mornfang Brown to pick out details on the raised edges. Quite a liberal coating, but also making sure that I was careful not to catch any of the pieces of armour. And following that, I then used Averland Sunset to give a second dry brush. This was even lighter, really just putting in highlights on the rock. Finally, to bring it all together, I gave the rock a very liberal coat of Agrax Earthshade. I find that this just helps to matte down the brightness of some of the colours of the yellow and the brown on the rock, and just gives it a much more natural feel. And that was a good spot to end day 2 of painting on this model. I just left it from here overnight to fully dry before moving on to the highlights. So a new day and a new set of challenges with this paint job. I started off doing a layer highlight using Wraithbone on all the parchment and scroll work on the miniature, making sure that I was leaving all of the wash in the recesses to give it that look as if the parchment was moving more, blowing in the wind as it were. After this I switched to Corax White and just picked out the very tips of the parchment paper. I find this little clamp tool very helpful for painting in detail like this. Whereas I tend to shake all over the place, this will keep whichever part of the sub-assembly I'm painting in place and steady for me. With the parchment done, it was time to start highlighting the armour. Normally when I paint Space Marines, I give them an edge highlight to pick out all the armour. So this is something I've done for many years on my Space Wolf miniatures. To keep this Wolf Priest in keeping with the existing army, I started off by doing an edge highlight using Mechanicus Standard Grey. Once I'd finished, I felt that the overall effect was a bit too bright, so this was the point where I used the Nuln Oil wash again to go back over the armour. In hindsight, don't wash black armour with a black ink, but wait until you've highlighted it, and that just helps dull down the colours. Once that had dried fully, I then switched on to to start working on the skulls. All those hundreds and hundreds of skulls. I just started by picking out the raised details using Wraithbone and also putting a layer highlight over the tops of the skulls where the light would naturally catch, but being really careful to make sure that that wash that I'd put over them earlier was still prevalent in the recesses. While that was drying, I just moved on to the purity seals again, the actual wax part this time, and I used Screamer Pink just to pick out some of the raised details on them. And not forgetting the seal on the book at the back as well. As a final highlight on the purity seals on the backpack, I used Corax White where the light would be catching most. And with a Corax White, I then moved back onto the skulls to put a final highlight just on the very highest of raised edges and the very tops of the cranium where the light would naturally be reflecting. So onto the face, and I used Rakarth Flesh just to pick out the details. For such a small area, there is a surprising amount of details on this miniature on the face, including lines down his jaw and on his cheeks, and also some frown marks across his forehead. I also wanted to make sure that the lead Belcher mask that was in place didn't get affected with this, and also keeping the wash that I'd used on the face very strong on the point where it joined onto the mask, and this actually gave it quite a nice raw looking effect. I added a little bit of Corax White to the Rakarth Flesh and just did a few more highlights on the raised areas on his cheeks, on his eyebrow and on the very top of his head. Moving on to the metal parts of the miniature, I used Stormhost Silver just to pick out some of the highlights on his belt buckle, also painted in just the very tip of his belt, and also picked out the muzzle and some of the areas on the bolt pistol. So moving on to his tabard loincloth thing. I started off by going back to the original base colour of Rhinox Hide, and I put in a layer of this, leaving the deepest recesses untouched, so the natural shading that the wash had put in at this point could really continue on. And then I just progressively added a little bit more white to the Rhinox Hide, making very small gradients, slowly building up that layer until all the details were picked out. Next, just moving on to the Crozius handle, I wanted to put in just a bit of detail on there just to really make it pop. So using Mechanicus Standard Grey, I just put in a very small highlight in the top sort of third of each diamond on the Crozius, and this took absolutely ages to do, but was very worth it. While I had the Mechanicus Standard Grey out, I also added an edge highlight on the tabard just to give a slightly different tone on the very peaks. And I also find that adding this to the Mornfang Brown on the tabard gives it an almost threadbare, slightly worn look. So I do like to use this effect. So off camera, I just wanted to do a few bits of fine detail. Using Abaddon Black, I put in just some indications of text on all of the scroll work. Not something I'd normally do on rank and file, but for this one I just really wanted to go to town. Also picked out his eyes using a small dot of Corax White and then an even smaller black dot for the pupil. Apart from adding a pack marking to his shoulder, I think that we can class this miniature as done. I had a lot of fun painting this miniature. Took a lot longer than I expected it to, but really pleased with the final output. For me, I think that the scroll work is something I'm really pleased with, slowly getting better and better at that. The face, not quite so pleased with, and just something I need to practice more. If I do anything different with this in the future, probably would be to not give it the black wash as soon as the armour was painted, but actually wait until the edge highlighting was done. So, hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, hit the like button. If you'd like to see more of this, please subscribe, and I'll see you next time for the next edition of Midlife Crisis.